holistic home. I'm glad that you're here. I have been asked by a couple people to kind of go a step by step through how I make my einkorn bread. I do use, for the most part, the recipe from the Jovial website, but I do a couple of things differently. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do as I kind of go through this tutorial is I try to do it while narrating it. However, there was a lot of background noise. So in the end, what I'm going to do is just dub over a narration over what you're kind of seeing on the screen. I did not capture some of the steps, as when I prepared the final loaf, it was 5 a.m. in the morning because I had a lot of things I needed to do. So I had to get that loaf in and out before I left. So some of the things I did forget to kind of show, but hopefully you will be able to get the gist of how I make my bread. Now, einkorn is a little bit different than regular sourdough. There are some things you are going to see that are different along the way. One of the things that I do not do is I do not keep an active starter on my counter that is fairly large, mainly because einkorn is expensive. So kind of doing that discard process, you waste a lot of einkorn flour. And instead, I keep a very small dough ball in my fridge, and then I make a levain with that dough ball later on. And so you'll kind of see that process. I'm going to start by showing how I refresh the starter from my fridge, and then how I'm able to use that to make my levain. Now, you can use the starter straight from the fridge if you scrape off kind of some of the grayish hooch that's on the top and go straight to the levain, but it will take a little bit longer to kind of do that process. Now, I make my einkorn kind of differently every time. It just depends on what time of day I'm able to make my levain, or if I'm able to do it in the morning, or if the starter's ready, or whatever. So it really just depends. This way that I'm showing you is kind of one of the best ways I find to get the biggest rise and the best results. So I hope that you enjoy this tutorial. So one of the things that I'm going to show first, as I said, is how to refresh the starter. So I'm going to take 10 grams of my leftover starter, and I'm going to add it to a bowl. I'm going to weigh it because weighing is really the most accurate way to get the best results with your bread. So just getting a cheap kitchen scale is really the best method. Then I'm going to add 30 grams of water to the starter. Now, I do not add warm water, even though that's coming out of a kettle. I do not add warm water to any of my bread recipes or my starter recipes. And the reason why is, in my house, we keep our temperature around 73, 74. And so bread typically will overproof if I use warm water. Then I'm going to add 60 grams of all-purpose Jovial flour. Now, this recipe is all calling for all-purpose. If you use whole wheat flour, you are going to have to change the amounts of water. You're going to have to change the amounts of flour. You're going to have to change some different things. So just keep that in mind, that I'm going to be using the all-purpose, because I do find that the all-purpose does give the best rise when it comes to einkorn flour. Whole wheat in general is going to give a denser bread in general, even with regular wheat. With einkorn, it absolutely is not going to rise as much as it will with the all-purpose flour. So here I am kind of mixing up my refresh starter. You can see that it is a very dry dough ball. Most of the time at the end, I kind of have to squeeze it with my hands to kind of absorb that leftover flour. After the dough ball has kind of got all the flour in, I'm going to put it in this glass container, and usually I let it rise a little bit on the counter before I put it in the fridge. The next day, it is going to look like this. You can see that it is spread out, and this is what I'm going to use to make my levain. You can see there's no hooch on the top because this is a brand new refresh starter that I let sit overnight. If it was coming from the fridge, it would have hooch on the top, and you would scrape that off and just use what's underneath. So this is going to be a really nice refresh starter, and I am going to use 30 grams of this starter in my bread recipe. So here I am just putting in the 30 grams from my refresh starter. Now I'm going to reset my scale, and I'm going to add 130 grams of water. Again, the water is in a kettle, but it is not warm. I do use cool water, but if you are in a very cool house, you may want to use room temperature to a little bit warmer water in order to get your levain to rise. Now, again, I am also doing this with a really nice, fresh, bubbly starter. So I am prepping my levain in the morning and I will have about 7 hours before it is ready to go, and I will be able to mix up my dough in the evening. If you are doing this with a cold starter, I would recommend doing your levain overnight just to give it a little bit more time to truly get nice and bubbly. But because I'm using that refresh starter, I can kind of do it in the morning. And then I'm going to add 120 grams of the all-purpose flour from Jovial. It is my favorite Einkorn flour to use. And then I'm going to also reset my scale. So this is a way to just, you don't have to get out measuring cups, nothing. You just reset the scale and pour. It is worth its weight in gold to really have that kitchen scale. I could not make bread without it. So I'm going to make the 120 grams, and then I'm going to mix that up. And this is going to create basically a larger starter or a levain, which is going to be used in this recipe. Now, what's really amazing is if you get the Jovial cookbook, which I will link, that cookbook has so many recipes, and the recipes will say if you can use yeast or you can use the Jovial levain. So you make this levain, you can make several different recipes with this levain that you kind of learn how to make in that book, which I absolutely love. So that's what it looks like. And then I'm going to cover it with plastic wrap. Yes, I know plastic wrap is what it is, but it's what I'm using for now. Now you can see that's after a couple of hours. It's not fully ready yet. It has some bubbles, but it's not quite there. After about 7 hours, it's going to look like this. And you can see all the bubbles on the top, and it has really risen in its size. And that's really what we want it to look like. And honestly, if you can use beeswax wraps or you can use those silicone mats, those are better. I just have plastic wrap on hand, so I'm using it until it's gone. Then I'm going to pour my levain into the main bread dough bowl. Now you can barely see in this video, but it is on top of my scale. Now I am not weighing my levain because it's already been weighed. I'm just trying to get as much of it out of the bowl as I can. So I'm getting all that yeasty goodness into my bread to help it rise. And then I'm going to add my water. Now, this recipe is going to call for less water than a traditional sourdough recipe. This is 275 grams of water. And when you hear how much flour is going in, you might be shocked if you do regular sourdough bread recipes. So here I am just weighing out my 275 grams of water. Again, I use cold water, but you can use warm water. Then I put about 2 teaspoons of salt. Maybe more. I kind of just scoop it in. I'm not accurate on my salt measurements. And then I'm going to stir it up. I'm going to stir up that levain into the water. Now, because the levain is kind of watery on its own, it dissolves very easily. Okay, so here I'm going to add my Jovial flour. Now, I use this Jovial flour here for another recipe, so normally it doesn't just run out with one loaf of bread. This is going to be 600 grams of flour. So you can see it was 275 grams of water. Now, the levain is quite a bit of like water because it is 130 grams to 120 grams of flour in the levain. So I'm going to mix up that dough. Now, do not add more water. It may feel like it's very dry, but it will, I promise you, it will soak into the flour and it will change as time goes on. So I let it kind of sit there for about 30 minutes before I'm going to do my first set of kind of stretch and folds. And I'm going to do this every 15 minutes. After the first 30, I'm going to do it every 15 minutes for an hour. And so I'm not going to show every single one of those here. I'm going to show kind of the first one. The dough will get much smoother than this as you kind of continue in that process. And then after that, I let my dough sit for 2 hours maximum before I do my final proof. This is because, again, I keep my house at a 74 to 73 degree temperature here. So my bread is going to proof relatively quickly. And I find one of the biggest mistakes I made when I first started with Einkorn was I was overproofing it all the time. So I do about 2 hours after this process, I'm going to do my final rise.
Okay, y'all, I am really bad at doing these tutorials, but after you are done with the stretch and fold, you let it rise. Then what you're gonna do is you're gonna take the dough out and you're gonna do a final shaping. This really doesn't matter too much how you do this. You can do this like regular sourdough, fold it over, fold it over, fold it over, fold it over, flip it over, and then just kind of spin it. How I do it is I basically take it like a round disc and I pull towards the middle. I just pull pieces all the way around the middle, into the middle, and then I flip it over, and then I'm going to just kind of roll my hands under the bottom so that the bottom gets sealed. And then you're going to flip this into a Banneton basket. Banneton baskets are really useful for einkorn because einkorn can lose its shape and things like that. So this is going to give it a pretty look to it, also because you really cannot do fancy scoring on einkorn like you can because of the weaker gluten structure. You can't do those fancy pretty scoring. So this kind of gives it that pretty look. So I basically dusted this in there very generously, especially since I'm going to put it in the fridge, with einkorn flour, dusted the top of my dough and flipped it in, and you can see it's there. And then I'm going to put some plastic wrap over the top, and then I put a plate on top of that plastic wrap to kind of seal it in, because I don't want a skin to form on this as much as possible, since I am going to do my final proofing in the fridge. I have found with einkorn bread that proofing it at some point along the way in the fridge does help it get a better rise. I have found that einkorn tends to overproof very quickly. And so doing this final proof like this usually helps. Sometimes I'll do my whole proofing, like if I am running out of time and I've done my stretch and folds and it's 9 or 10 o'clock at night and I don't have 2 hours to let it sit on the counter before I put it before I do the final thing, because this is only 2 hours worth of proofing, because literally in my house, if I let it go for a third hour before I proof it and put it in this, I'm done. It's overproofed. I've just learned my house, and I've learned how einkorn kind of works in my house. And so sometimes I'll just do the proofing in the fridge, and then I'll take it out in the morning and let it kind of proof a little bit more in the Banneton basket, and then I'll bake it. In this case, I was able to let it sit on the counter for a couple of hours, and then I'm doing the final proofing in the fridge. And I will literally just take this straight out of the Banneton basket tomorrow morning, put it straight into the Dutch oven, and go. I will not wait for the dough to warm up. I find that if you go from the cooler dough, it also helps it to rise a little bit better. So see you tomorrow.
So here I'm going to set my temperature to 500 degrees. And that is just to preheat. I put my Dutch oven into the oven and I allow it to preheat with the oven. Then I'm going to this is my proofed overnight einkorn bread in the Banneton basket. You can see the plastic is a little bit stuck. I'm going to kind of pull that off. And while the oven is preheating, the dough is going to be out of the oven for that hour that the oven is kind of preheating and the Dutch oven is getting warm. I like to leave it in there for about an hour. So then I'm going to take my pot out of the oven, and then I'm going to flip my dough into it very quickly, just like that. And it came out perfectly. And then I'm going to score it. You got to be very careful with scoring einkorn. You cannot do fancy scoring. So I just do a simple square. The Banneton basket gives it enough prettiness. And then I'm going to put the lid on it and put it in the oven. I'm going to decrease the temperature to 450 degrees, and I'm going to cook it for 45 minutes. Now note, you keep the lid on it the entire time. This is the final result. This was probably my favorite loaf of einkorn bread that I have ever made. That final proofing in the fridge really makes the difference. You can see how much of a rise it got and how crispy the crust looks, and that is with the lid being on it for the entire 45 minutes. Einkorn crust just tends to form a little bit crispier than regular sourdough, so that is why you keep kind of the lid on it the entire time. And it was absolutely beautiful inside. It was delicious and my family loved it. And I hope you find the same good results using this recipe.